Hey, welcome to the podcast. Joel here with Dad.
And I'm Rick. And we're good to be together. What are we talking about?
Well, so we've been talking about the whole year's theme is mountains we got to conquer. And I had a guy come up to me last Sunday after I gave a message about, I was talking about how the obstacle is the way. And like the thing you don't want to confront is the thing you need to confront. And he's like, all right, I get it. I got to confront the mountains, whatever. But he said, I have no motivation. Last year he got like the wind knocked out of his sails there. He had some relational challenges, financial challenges. He's like, I just can't find any reason to get up in the morning. Interestingly enough, I've talked to a lot of guys in their 40s that actually say that. There's like this window in your 40s where you start to go, it's the kind of the King Solomon moment where you go, meaningless. Like I could work harder, but what really more is it going to get me? And if I did get more, that what I really want. So he said, what do I do? I was like, that is a great question because that is something I struggle with constantly in this season. I don't have any motivation. There's all sorts of stuff I could do that I'm like, I don't want to do them if there's nothing gonna, it's all the results that are going to come on the other side of it. So my advice to him was sometimes you have to find, ultimately I think you have to have an internal motivation. Yeah. But I said, sometimes you've got to find the motivation externally for a season. And it made me think of James where it says faith apart from works is dead, how they go together hand in hand. So if you're not feeling it, you're not feeling the faith, you do the works and the feeling will follow. Sometimes you have to do the thing and then the feeling will follow. And I realized that's actually very biblical, but I think there are certain seasons in life where you literally have to find your motivation outside of yourself because you're not going to feel it. And you may not be getting any cheering from people around you to keep going. You're not going to be celebrated like you think you should, but you've got to find something outside of yourself to stay motivated. So that works for me. What's your experience with staying motivated?
Well, that's a good question. I do think, though, that, somewhere in the, say, you're saying like in the 40s, somewhere in there, something does change because I don't know if it's hormonal, I don't know what it is, but suddenly you lose that drive to conquer every mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which maybe that's good because your goal be helping those coming behind you to climb the mountain, right? Yeah. Richard Rohr says this. He says, success has nothing to teach you after age 30.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, I was just thinking about, the book you've referred to before, Strength to Strength. I can't remember the author's name, but he talks about how, you reach a point where you have a different type of intellect, is what he calls it, and actually I think he's quoting some other guy's research where you have the fluid intellect when you're younger and you're creative and you're driven and you got all this, you're making the new stuff. And then when you get to your end of your 40s, there kind of comes this crystallized intellect to where all of a sudden now you actually are, you've got more reserves, you've got a bigger library stored in your head, but you don't have that fluid. It takes longer to get it. And now your mind is a little more crystallized. You begin to feel like you're falling apart because you can't remember words. You can't remember things you used to remember.
Right.
But it's that you're changing. And so as far as the motivation goes, true motivation is always internal. But a lot of times, when you were saying you just start doing it, I remember reading, I think it was Stephen King or somebody on writing, and they said, or maybe it was Eleanor Roosevelt. She's always quoted, but I don't know. She always gets credit. When nobody knows who said it, she or Confucius gets credit. So one of them said this, that you just have to start writing whatever's in your brain. Just start putting it down on the paper. You can't sit there and stare at a blank piece of paper. You just start writing, and then something will begin to bubble up outside.
Yeah.
You just stream of consciousness, just begin writing. And so you just get up and start doing it and see what happens. Comes from there.
It's interesting. I heard a Jewish guy talking about that one time. He said the difference between Christians and Jews is Christians, say all the work starts inside and passes to the outside. I'm like, yeah, that is true. Like if you really want transformation, it starts inside and you do. And he says, we Jews believe the opposite. You do the law and then the feelings will follow.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's interesting because both are true.
Right.
And I think in different seasons of life, you need different motivations. You mentioned 2 books right now that actually were transformational for me. I'm going to put the link in the show notes because the 2 books changed me. One of them's the book by Brooks, Arthur. Is it Arthur Brooks?
I think it is Arthur Brooks.
Strength to Strength. Best book I read in 2024? Did I read that last year? Best book I read.
I thought you were going to say in 20 years or something. Wow,
no, it is probably the best book I've read in about 10 years. But yeah, Strength to Strength by Arthur Brooks. And then the other one is On Writing by Stephen King. Yes, that's Stephen King, the guy that wrote all the horror books.
Yeah.
But his book about writing it's incredible.
It really is good. Yeah, I read that one too.
Yeah.
And the Strength to Strength, by the way, is available on Audible for those of you who like to listen to it like me.
Yeah.
I'll listen to it driving to work and back.
Well, that was one that, I get all my books on audio first, especially if I can get them from the library because it saves me a lot of money. But if a book is really good, I go and order the paperback. I'm reading one right now. This is turning into a book recommendations thing.
Yeah.
Called The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. And I started listening to it. I was like, holy cow, I have to get the paperback of this. So I got the paperback of it, but I usually do audio too. Maybe that's a function of the season of life we're in right now. I just have a hard time staying motivated to read, but if someone's reading to me, I can sit quietly in a room and listen to a person reading to me for hours on end.
Well, I usually do it driving because that's the time I can do it. And, otherwise you're listening to the radio and it's like, or something, or you're sitting there quietly, which isn't bad either. But anyway, so as far as the motivation, a lot of times you just, and again, a guy, if you've got the option of not doing anything, you're different than most people because most people, okay, I may hate my job, but I just got to get up and go to work because I'm not going to get paid if I don't, And so sometimes that's your motivation. Sometimes you just got to do it because you got to do it.
Talk about external motives. You're going to get fired if you don't show up.
Exactly, yeah. And so if you've got the luxury of being able to decide, oh my God, my self-motivation just isn't there. Tough, dude. You got to show up on the job and do your work.
But even that, we're supposed to work joyfully, cheerfully. Like, how do you find? Yeah.
Well, technically, that's according to your business teachings. That's not true. Motivation comes from within. You're as a leader, you're supposed to be motivating your people to have that internal drive and everything.
Right.
But sometimes just having to get up and do it. You know?
Which makes me think, okay, so King Solomon, my favorite book of the Bible is Ecclesiastes, which many people find morbid and dark, but I think Ecclesiastes is the greatest book of the Bible because it is a guy who says, here's reality. This is reality. There's I talk to people all the time. I'm like, that's in Ecclesiastes. Talking to somebody the other day, like, why would you take your daughter to a funeral? And I'm like, because King Solomon said it's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of great mirth. Because when you keep death in front of you, it keeps life in perspective. Somebody the other day was complaining to me about he's about to hand down all this money to his kids, and he's like, I'm afraid they're going to squander it. And I was like, that's in Ecclesiastes too.
It's in Proverbs too, by the way, which is one of my favorite books. So you don't have to go that.
But he says, King Solomon says, I'm going to hand all this stuff, this success, down to my kids, and who knows what they're going to do with it. They may just blow it and ruin it and be gone in a generation.
Yeah.
So all that to say, King Solomon, it's interesting in his book, Ecclesiastes, because he literally lays out the realities of life, that's what people go, it's such a dark book. It's not dark. It's just what it is, man. If you live a little bit and look at reality, that's what it is. But he always goes back to the idea that he goes back to the external motivation idea. The external motivation, which ultimately becomes internal, is we're living for more than under the sun. So everything he says is, this is meaningless under the sun. This too is meaningless under the sun. All your labor and toil, all that trying to, get the boat, the car, whatever it is. He doesn't say that, but that's my translation. If you get to a point where you go, I got it all, it's meaningless. Unless you keep your life in perspective under the sun. So it goes back to, which seems to be everything we go to on the show, is, are you keeping your life in eternal perspective?
Yeah. Well, that's what the conclusion of the matter of Ecclesiastes ends with is fear God and keep his commandments, for that's the whole duty of man. Just so and if you don't have that eternal perspective, then it is all really for nothing. It is all vain. And that's what the message of Ecclesiastes is. You're living under the sun, life here on this earth without an eternal perspective. Yeah, it's all going to just burn up. It's all going to go away. You're just wasting your time in your life. So that eternal perspective. So
yeah, here's what he says in Ecclesiastes 12, where it ends. He goes, it's interesting. He says, now all has been heard. And this is after 12 chapters of rambling. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God, Keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So it's the idea that
living for that day.
Living for when you stand before him to be found.
Yeah. Living for that day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So motivation, I mean, is part of it too is different if it's a short-term thing, because it may just, who's motivated when the weather's yucky outside and it's muggy and it's, so it can just be the weather. It can be your diet, get off the sugar for a while, that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of things in the short term. In the long term, it may be too that God's got another thing for you, and this is kind of winding down and it's coming. Because I know there was a time when I went through about 6 months of just, I'm just spinning the wheel. All I'm doing is like a hamster on a wheel, just spinning the wheel. And I went through the motions. You just do it because it needs to be done. And that's what actually a lot of life is, that you just do it because it needs to be done.
Right.
And but then the Lord opened up a whole new thing that challenged me.
So you're saying there are seasons in life where lack of motivation may be an indication that a change is coming, and you're in that kind of stage where maybe he's trying to make it uncomfortable for you enough to where you'll actually move.
You'll be happy to accept something new, yeah. Because there are seasons. God gives us in nature the picture of seasons in our lives, and there's the springtime that's a very productive season, and then there's summer where it's not as productive, it's pleasant, but and then there's the fall when things seem to be falling apart. And then there's the winter where nothing's really growing, nothing's being produced. Our whole life, as a young person, you're very productive, and then as you get old. But you also have seasons like that in your life, micro seasons, where it just doesn't seem to be a real productive time. You just gut it out, and you just hang in there and wait for the springtime and look for the springtime to come. So we all go through times like that. It's very natural.
That's a really good point, too, because you're not always going to feel, I don't know, man, there are some personality types that it seems like they're always motivated, but I've also found those people are generally a little bit out of balance.
Yeah.
The reason they're so motivated is they're trying to prove something, prove their value, prove their worth or something. And that's an interesting angle on it too, because that's not a healthy motivation in some ways, to prove I'm worth something, to prove I'm, I think it's out of balance. I think we've been put on earth to accomplish specific purpose. You are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he prepared beforehand that you should walk in them, Ephesians 2:10. But if what you're trying to do is get approval, acceptance, feel good about yourself, that's the wrong motivation, right?
Yeah, it goes back again to what's the heart attitude, what's the reason for it. If you're trying to please God or something like that, and you feel like somehow you're earning favor with the Lord, that's the wrong motivation. And I've seen a lot of people like that too, the Tiggers of life, they're always bouncing around. But they oftentimes crash, and you don't see them when they crash because they're hiding out at home or whatever,
Yeah.
Because they crash big.
And a lot of times those Tiggers are, there's the joyful people that just like to find the next fun thing, which that'll wear thin. King Solomon talks about that in Ecclesiastes. But there's also the ones that are achieving, which King Solomon talks about that too. I'm going to build bigger barns. I'm going to do this. Sometimes not even with a central purpose in mind. It's just, here's something we can do just because it's there, so let's do it.
Yeah.
But that eventually runs thin too, because you're going, what's the point? Especially when you burn out or if you see failure after failure.
Yeah. So, again, that the guy there who's lacking the motivation. So what else would you tell him?
That's all I told him. I was like, suck it up, buttercup.
Yeah.
Sometimes you ain't going to feel it, but you got to do it. And then the feelings follow.
Yeah.
And again, that's so important. It goes back to knowing your why, which we've talked about. Podcast. Somebody told me you need a podcast. 10 years ago, they told me that. And I knew I didn't want to do it unless I had some driving motivation to keep me going. And I had a moment one day, we're sitting at your house talking. I was like, the only thing I really enjoy doing is talking to my dad, getting his wisdom. One day, Elise is not going to have you around. And I was like, you know what? We need to capture this wisdom of you and me talking, and hopefully there's some wisdom I'm sharing too. And so I'm doing this for Elise. This podcast is literally for Elise. I get a lot of fun out of it. I think you do too. But when you've got the why, there's sometimes we're just not feeling it, but we start talking. And it's like, oh, this is great.
Of course, it's the same thing as with that inheritance that guy's talking about. You may have all these somewhere recorded, and she may go, what is all that junk? Throw that right in the trash.
That's true.
So So anyway, hopefully somebody listening to us today is getting some benefit out of it as well. But if that motivates you that someday Elise is going to listen to all these, my goodness, she'd have a pretty dull life, wouldn't she?
Thanks for listening. Please consider sharing this with your friends on the platform of your choice. For more from Joël Malm, visit joelmalm.com. For more from Rick Malm, visit rickmalm.com. Our podcast music was produced by Alex Burleson.